The dead would not stay still. Zoras fought to free the glowing ruby atop the closer ziggurat. His chanting voice carried across the cavern words of a language Ulrun vaguely recognized as Elder. He had traveled with the Elderkin, but had only learned enough to sing some of their songs round campfires. The sorcerers building shrill incantations were nothing like those bawdy tunes. Whatever he was doing, Ulrun had other business to attend to. Heaps of bones climbed to unsteady feet, eyes glowing with icy blue points of light that seemed all the more terrible for the ruddy cast of the light. Brave blade flashed in Ulrum's fist as he hacked one down after another, keeping them away from the steps. Always more bones were pulling themselves together, rising, grasping at the rusted hilts of crumbling swords and taking up ancient pitted spearheads. "Clear a path to the sarcophagus, Slayer!" the sorcerer shouted. Ulrum looked up sharply. Zoras was holding the heart-shaped gem above his head. It pulsed angrily. "Now!" Ulrum parried an incoming thrust with his blade and stepped aside. The skeleton bore a bronze buckler. He wrenched at it, ripping the arm free of its socket, sending it clattering across the ground. He kicked the creature in the rib cage, shattering it and sending a leering skull rolling between the legs of yet more of them. They came slowly, but they came in numbers, shuffling their feet, blades dragging limply behind them. Ulrum retreated, giving himself ground, and worked his arm into the buckler's handle. With a fierce roar he charged forward, battering a path through the enemy. "We could use 100 men now," he called, coming close to the foot of the second ziggurat. "Push them back!" Zora's voice was strained with effort, close behind the rift Ulrum had torn open. "I am! There's no end to them! Where's all your magic now, old crow?" Zora's barked something like laughter. "We're not in my lair now, boy! Move your feet!" Stabbing blades and cutting knives came at them by the score from the gloom, their crumbling edges flashing with eerie, blood-chilling blue light of their unseeing eyes. Teeth clattered as jaws worked, unable to make any other sound. Flesh had dried along stick-thin limbs, and knots of something unspeakable writhed beneath the surface of their skin, swarming, shivering, forcing the bodies to press the attack. Ulrum used his shield as a bludgeon, batting aside swords and spears, and sweeping in broad arcs with brave blade, cutting down one slow-moving target after another. But it was never enough. He was drenched in sweat as he did his gruesome work, for the heat coming off the ruby in Zora's hand was brutal. The old man issued no complaint, but Ulrum saw that his robes were soaked, and his skin seemed loose, hanging from him like a starved man. Even still he cast gouts of flame at their flanks, igniting the closest thralls into brief pillars of stinking fire that illuminated the horrible ranks behind them. The storm in the blade pressed on grimly, but Zora's panting under the strain of his burden, his fire growing weaker, and Ulrum was left fighting ever more desperately to keep the tide at bay. They broke through to the foot of the ziggurat. Zora staggered up the steep steps toward the pinnacle. Ulrun came up behind him slowly, kicking and spitting like a raging cougar at the revenants that pursued them, jabbing clumsily at his legs. He bellowed in outrage as an edge caught him, slicing his calf. Ulrum brought his sword down on the culprit's head, cleaving the skull. It crumpled to the ground, bones spilling vacantly down the steps. He turned and dashed up the remaining stairs, heedless of his wounded leg, of the bright pain where he still bore stitches. Something wet and hot was working its way down his back, and he was certain it was blood. It was not until he had reached the top of the ziggurat, and saw the old sorcerer standing by it, that he realized the enormity of the stone sarcophagus. "The shade we will encounter is but a starved fragment of the thing my forebears buried here. Even still, it will be deadly. We must keep it from becoming whole again, and cast it back into the abyss forever." "I won't blink when death calls my name," Ulrum growled, "but I prefer it not to linger. I cannot see a way out of this burial pit you've brought me to. So good. Let them come. Let's finish this and be gone." "Those thralls are my master's work. Guardians against the very thing we are about to do."
"Guardians? What in the hell's are you about to do?"
Orm snarled as he drove the next wave of undead back. Orm had a sinking feeling about what Zorez was planning. He laughed cruelly and drove back another wave of the restless dead.
"No man alive has killed me yet. You dead have already lost your claim on me. Back!"
he roared, brandishing brave blade. He had to fight the impulse to leap down into the melee. The spirit of war was upon him now, the battle rage of the conqueror striding beneath the bloody sun. He had seen worse straits than this. Or had he?
"At the fields of Aranor!"
howled one echo within him.
"At the Gap, during the reclamation!"
They clamored within him, each a glory of its own. He could have lost himself in those memories, which were a part of him, part of the ring, but not his own. But for the glowing blue eyes of his adversaries he would have succumbed. Those dead lights grounded him. He would win his glory, here and now, but not by leaping to his death among 100 spears. There was a jagged noise of glass breaking behind Orm, and he glared over his shoulder to see that Zorez had smashed the great ruby on the lid of the sarcophagus. The Magus's good eye looked woefully up at him. Zorez seemed to have aged 10 years in mere minutes, his robes billowing about a withered frame that seemed too frail for life.
"It is done."
A beating heart 3 times the size of a normal man's thumped wetly on the stone lid amongst the shards of its case. Around the chamber the undead began to collapse. Whatever spirit animated them fled their desiccated limbs in an instant, the spell or curse upon them broken and gone. Shields, spears, and swords clattered back to the earth. Skulls rolled blindly about, their baleful grins leering up out of the dark that washed out over them. There came a sound like distant thunder emanating from the depths, like the deep bones of the earth being snapped by devil hands. Orm staggered, all his senses tuned to the enveloping blackness and a rising noxious presence. A thunderclap struck the room, and the stone lid of the sarcophagus broke into fragments. Zorez scrambled backwards. He gripped Orm by the front of his tunic and shouted, "Hold your ground! For this I have brought you here!" Orm stared incredulously at the old man scuttling down the ziggurat's steep face and into the shadows below. He looked back to the sarcophagus. At the ruins of the lid were shoved aside. Long, twisted black fingers wrapped themselves around the rim, and a horror pulled itself up and out. For the first time since leaving his father's house, Orm felt true fear. Not the uncertain anxiety of awaiting a charge, or the shock at the sight of his own blood. True, soul-chilling terror rose out of the sarcophagus, and the waves of its hatred and contempt washed over him like icy water. It was as unlike a man as an empty barrel to a cavern. 10 feet tall, its skin was depthless black, that reflected no light. The fiend had long, unproportionate limbs, shaped at odd angles, more arachnid than human, clicked when they moved. The edges of the creature seemed to ebb like shadows at twilight, limned by the beating red of a huge heart it held in one claw. Above sharp black shoulders that tapered to rising points, the fiend had death's visage for a head. Bone-white and broad at the base, it tapered to a narrow, jagged nasal cavity. 2 twisted black horns curled above wide eye sockets that glared with hellish light. Beneath the muzzle of the bull's skull, a writhing black tongue flickered thick as a drowned man's swollen arm.
"I am returned,"
it whispered with horrible malicious glee, the sound cutting into Orm's mind like a garrote. Something within him shifted. He grit his teeth and shifted his stance to balance on the balls of his feet.
"You won't pass me,"
he said. His voice sounded small in the huge hollow. The great lich was nearly twice his size, yet he stood his ground, blade in hand, ready to meet his doom. It finally seemed to notice him. The heat and light emanating from the heart had grown stronger now for being held by its master. The dead tongue laughed with the inscrutable mirth of the damned.
An inheritor put me in the ground. Another greets me as I wake. The wheel turns.
The beast held its left hand high above its head. There was a shifting and grinding on the floor of the chamber below. Ulrim staggered, trying to keep his balance. The bones of the thralls he had sent back to their deaths rattled noisily down the sides of the ziggurat, and the whole world seemed to buck and tumble. Stalactites crashed to the floor, sending fragments of stone hurling across the chamber. 2 of the columns that lined the sepulchre collapsed, crashing across the floor.
Rise!
The dead tongue cackled.
With this heart I reclaim my buried soul and rebuild that which was cast down.
On the floor below, where once had been a flat plain covered in the broken bones of the fallen, now emerged Zora's 3rd ziggurat. It grew with impossible and terrible speed, and amongst the darkness below, Ulrim caught a flash of movement skulking toward the new platform. He turned back to his enemy. It was moving now, sliding forward with a sickly, oily speed, foul tongue lashing. Ulrim attacked. Howling like a wolf on the heels of its prey, he surged forward and slashed at the dead tongue's inhuman legs. His sword connected, and the fiend hissed shrilly. It leapt away from him and crouched, the scarlet lights in the sockets of the bull's skull studying him.
I know your scent, Fustunustir. Give up this hopeless chase. The flesh of this whelp you wear is crazed and diseased. How must you seethe against his wildness?
I am Ulrim the Slayer,
the man shouted, and attacked again. The fiend drew a great black sword out of thin air. Nearly as long as Ulrim was tall, it was all he could do to meet the vicious parry. He narrowly avoided being impaled on its deadly barbed point. The dead tongue cackled, its rotten tongue flashing under square teeth.
You shall be the first and mightiest of my new thralls, my lictor.
Ulrim's answer was a mindless roar. He caught the dead tongue's backslash on his shield and ignored the shock of his arm going numb from the blow. He twisted his torso and drove his blade into the fiend's exposed flank, halfway to the hilt. The dead tongue reeled, hissing like 1,000 snakes, and toppled off the ziggurat. Ulrim roared triumphantly, lifting brave blade high above his head in salute. But the day was not won, the battle not yet through. Below, on the ground, he saw dead tongue regain its feet. The skull it wore had been knocked aside, revealing a nightmare where a face should have been. It had neither eyes nor nose, but a huge, slavering mouth, filled with fangs and that horrid thrashing tongue. It was an abomination out of the deepest nightmare of a deranged man. Ulrim's triumphant cry was choked off as it turned to look at the storm rider. Half crawling, half running, it crashed through the bones that littered the stone floor of the sepulchre and made for the newly raised ziggurat. The crimson light of the heart in its hand bounced wildly around, unpredictable as dice thrown across a table crowded with cups. Zora's was halfway up the stairs, dragging himself up one at a time. At the top of the ziggurat was a plain-looking stone jar set atop an altar of black stone. Ulrim saw all that in a glance, but it was not what held his eye. The old man was aging rapidly now. His hair was falling out, his skin mottled and pale. Even from afar, Ulrim could see that the years were passing through him as water through a sieve. What had happened? He knew little of magic, nothing of the lore that drew such men into these hateful, shadowed cysts. The old sorcerer cast a terrified glance over his shoulder and saw the fiend coming for him. He shrieked wordlessly and pulled himself up the next step. Ulrim bounded down the stairs, hurtling over the bones that had collected at the bottom. He charged into the dead tongue's side with all the force he could summon from his powerful legs. He passed through as if the fiend was made of but air and shadow, and hit the ground on the other side. Ulrim had just enough time to spin about, catching its savage return blow on the shield. That was more substantial. The force of it sent him hurtling a score of steps away. Ulrim landed painfully on his back in a pile of bones, and felt the air explode out of him. He sucked for breath, but caught none. Dark wings flapped at the edges of his vision. He felt his heart pounding painfully against his ribs, and the panic curling the base of his spine.
Get up!
Someone loomed over Ulrim, tall, powerfully built, with a lion's head above his broad shoulders. Yellow eyes with black slits glimmered down at him, and the strange visions shifted. No, not a lion, but a fierce-faced elderkin of immeasurable age and majesty. He held out a hand to Ulrim.
Finish the job! Earn it!
Ulrim grasped the hand and felt depthless strength flow into him. Golden light leapt from his ring, filling the chamber, scouring away the tortured shadows that writhed round the hideous columns, and which nestled under the bones of the dead men who had given their all to silence this great evil. On the third ziggurat the dead tongue now held Zora's storm rider up in the air by his throat. The old man thrashed and kicked, lashing at the lich with plumes of fire and flickering lightning, but to no avail. The monster laughed venomously, its heart held high in triumph, tongue flashing back and forth. But in the light of Ulrim's ring everything changed. He saw the truth uncloaked. The fiend was nothing more than a wretched man, long dead, shrouded in centuries of fear and hate and black promises. A slave of darkness, a restless puppet even in death.
It reeks of the old foe.
The echoes in him spoke now with one harmony, deep and dire as a war drum.
Slay it.
Ulrim started forward, brave blade in hand, power thundering through him like never before. The dead tongue turned to look at him as the illusion was shredded by Ulrim's approach. It let Zora's go, and the old man fell bonelessly to the side of the altar.
No! I will not go back!
The dead tongue raved, shielding its eyes and conjuring its black sword, but it was no longer 10 feet tall. The closer Ulrim came, the more diminished, until it stood no taller than any man. Naked in the light of Fustanustir's ring, it was a pitiful thing indeed. Ulrim met it full on, letting out a savage war-cry, and slapped the blade aside. He punched it in the mouth, feeling old teeth break and bone crack. The dead tongue collapsed to its knees before him, gasping. Its wretched, shriveled mouth worked around a shattered jaw. The voice that emanated from its burst throat was no mortal sound, but something deeper, more hateful, and more horrible for it.
For all your fury, you will burn in your last hour. You will hear the raven call of death on the day you take your crown, but short shall be your reign, lion-born.
Then I will break you again in the hells.
Ulrim cut off the fiend's head with a single stroke of brave blade. The chamber was filled with silence. Still clutched in the dead tongue's nerveless fingers, the pulsing ruby light of the heart began to weaken. Disgusted, with none of the triumph he had expected, Ulrim kicked the body aside, unable to banish the dead tongue's final words. Many years later, when he placed the crown of Isgard on his own fierce brow, he would recall them, and he would shiver when he heard the shrieking of the ravens feasting on the killing ground outside his hard-won fortress.